Let's jump right in. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're digging into Clint Eastwood's 2003 absolute masterpiece, Mystic River. Now, we aren't just looking at a standard police procedural here. No, we're really exploring the profound, permanent weight of generational trauma and how one single shattered moment can literally ripple through decades to create what is essentially a modern Greek tragedy.
To break down the anatomy of this tragedy, we're going to hit 5 key areas: the original sin, 3 fractured men, shadows of the river, tribalism and blind justice, and finally, the unwashable stain.
Let's start with Section 1, the original sin, establishing the foundation of trauma.
So, the big bang of this entire deterministic universe is a truly horrific act of predation way back in 1975. Dave is abducted by child predators posing as cops while just playing out in the street, right? And Jimmy and Sean, they just watch him get driven away. Fast forward decades later, and the brutal murder of Jimmy's daughter, Katie, forces these 3 men back together. But here's the thing, these characters never truly left the street corners of their childhood. The whole tragedy is basically a slow, agonizing tightening of a noose that was tied 25 years prior.
Think about the last time you saw a name carved in wet concrete. You know, it's a mark of existence, right? Well, when those predators pull up, Jimmy and Sean have already finished writing their names. But Dave is interrupted. His name is left incomplete, forever unsealed. It is just this heartbreaking, incredibly literal metaphor for a childhood cut tragically short. He is, in every sense, left an unfinished man.
Moving right along to Section 2, 3 fractured man, the psychological fallout.
That initial trauma fractures these boys into totally distinct psychological archetypes, heavily based on whatever role they played that day in 1975. Jimmy, the survivor, grows up to be the neighborhood kingpin, operating entirely on primal id and tribal law. Sean, the helpless observer, becomes a detective, trying to enforce institutional law, the ego. And Dave, the victim, becomes a walking ghost, or the superego. The incredibly horrific truth here is that the car didn't just take Dave that day, it completely took the versions of Jimmy and Sean that might have been.
Just look at Dave. He is a textbook, walking study in complex PTSD and dissociation. Sure, he physically came back from the woods, but psychologically, he never really left that cellar. He speaks kind of like a child, using a grown man's vocabulary, and he projects his very real abusers onto these imaginary vampires that he claims to fight. Dave has this haunting belief that the boy who got into the car actually died, and something cold and dead came back instead. That makes his eventual fate feel like the execution of a profoundly innocent, deeply wounded soul.
Then on the totally opposite extreme, we have Jimmy, the hypermasculine protector. When his daughter gets killed, it's not just a loss. It's a massive existential threat to his entire identity. He operates on this primitive, intense need for control, which effectively turns him into a sociopath who justifies his brutal violence as mere housekeeping. He is entirely blind to the fact that his desperate need for vengeance is actually turning him into the exact type of predator he claims to hate.
Let's look at Section 3, Shadows of the River, the environment and atmospheric weight.
You can't ignore the cinematography of the Boston landscape here. It is incredibly suffocating. You've got these desaturated blue and gray palettes totally draining the life from the streets, and ink-black shadows literally bisecting characters' faces to symbolize their fractured identities. Characters are constantly shot through foreground obstructions that look just like bars, so they always seem to be looking out from behind a prison of their own history. And here's a surprising fact. Clint Eastwood actually composed that mournful piano-heavy score himself. He purposefully drops the music entirely during moments of extreme violence, which creates this deeply unsettling, low-frequency hum of dread.
Jimmy really sums it up perfectly when he says, "We bury our sins here, Dave. We wash them clean." But I want you to really think about that, because the Mystic River is actually just a dark, turgid tomb. Unlike your classic literary symbols where water represents, rebirth and cleansing, this river doesn't clean a single thing. It just hides the rot. It literally absorbs the neighborhood's bodies and secrets just to keep up appearances, poisoning all the groundwater right beneath their feet.
Moving to Section 4, Tribalism and Blind Justice, the Rules of the Enclave.
This whole disaster is entirely inevitable, and it's all because of the neighborhood's strict code of silence, or omerta. It's this incredibly claustrophobic, insular culture where everybody knows everything, yet absolutely nobody talks to the police. It's a community that demands total, unquestioning loyalty, completely at the expense of morality. Because they have zero trust in external institutions, any disputes just immediately revert to swift, tribal violence.
And we have to talk about how the tragedy is directly fueled by the wives. Celeste Boyle's paralyzing doubt, her total inability to reconcile her traumatized husband with the vampire he claims to be, is what ultimately leads her to betray him. On the flip side, Annabeth Markham completely embodies this fierce, terrifying tribal loyalty. She justifies her husband's primitive violence just to protect their fragile illusion of order and family safety. In a very real way, the women's specific fears and ruthlessness directly hand the men their weapons.
This whole sequence just proves the ultimate futility of personal justice. Totally blinded by grief, Jimmy lures Dave to the river based on neighborhood logic. Terrified for his life, Dave falsely confesses to Katie's murder just to save himself, even though he's actually describing a completely different crime. But Jimmy murders his childhood friend anyway. And then, the absolute devastating gut punch lands the very next morning. Sean reveals that the real killers were just two neighborhood boys. Jimmy's logic is laid bare. When you take an eye in the dark, you usually just end up blind.
Finally, Section 5, the unwashable stain, the moral aftermath.
For me, the most horrifying realization of this entire story is just the sheer banality of the evil at the end. There is no clean, cathartic punishment for Jimmy. He goes home, washes his hands, and his wife literally praises him as a righteous king who cleanses his grief through blood. Jimmy has officially become the very wolf that entered their lives back in 1975. He's a predator, totally willing to consume the weak, even his own childhood friend, just to maintain his kingdom.
Now, at the end, during that sun-drenched neighborhood parade, Sean Devine looks across the street at Jimmy and makes a very deliberate finger gun gesture. It's one of the most debated moments in modern cinema. So what exactly is passing between the detective and the murderer here?
Well, the answer is incredibly bleak. It's definitely not some promise of a future arrest. It is a totally cynical acknowledgement of truth and complicity. Sean knows Jimmy killed Dave, and Jimmy knows that Sean knows. But in the twisted ecosystem of the Mystic River, there are no good guys left to actually make an arrest. The parade just goes on, cementing the deeply tragic reality that the original wolf finally finished its meal and institutional law is now completely complicit in the cover-up.
Trauma really is a contagion. It's this horrible debt that eventually gets collected, and often from the completely wrong person. This explainer really forces us to look at how unresolved history shapes our own world. So I'll leave you with this chilling thought. If we use the river to wash away our sins, but the water beneath stays stained forever, who among us isn't still sitting in the back of that car?